Welcome to the Bobby O Show. My name is Bob O. Potzner, and I have a show for you today that I hope you'll find as fascinating as I do. I have a great guest, Dr. Scott Rich, who's a neuroscientist, but also is involved in Duke basketball. We'll get into that a little bit later on. When I invited Scott to be on the show, I was thinking about having on because now it's the middle of March Madness. But as I got to know Scott's background a lot more, I realized he has a very interesting science background. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to try to do about half and half on the show today about his neuroscience activities and also about his knowledge about Duke basketball. Scott, welcome aboard. How you doing?
Thanks for having me, sir.
It is my pleasure to have you down here. It's funny how I learned about you. This is our first time we ever met. And I listened to a podcast for Duke basketball with Jason Evans and Donna Wine, and you've been on a few times, and I found out you were a Connecticut resident.
Yeah.
So I said, darn, I'm going to have this guy come and be on my show. But then that's how we developed that. And so I kept my ears open, and now we got a great show scheduled for today. But tell me about your background, please.
Yeah, so I am an assistant professor in the Department of Physiology and Neurobiology at UConn. That is my professional title. We'll talk more about my extracurricular activities in the second half of the show, I guess. But yeah, I am it's called a computational neuroscientist. I work in a department full of classic scientists that you think of working over a microscope, working with lab animals, working with chemicals. But everything I do is what we call dry lab computational research. My experiments are all on the computer, are all via computer simulation, using mathematical analysis to answer the same type of questions about the brain, answer questions about how we think and how the brain activity underlies that, asking questions about what goes awry in our brains in diseases like epilepsy and Parkinson's disease and stroke, and trying to answer those questions using computer simulation and mathematical modeling to do things that it's currently quite difficult to do experimentally, given all the limitations that we have about how we can manipulate and how we understand the brain.
Scott, you're a graduate, of Duke undergraduate, class 2012, right?
Yep.
And you majored in?
Mathematics.
But what was your minor?
So I was a math major, I was a minor in chemistry, and a minor in philosophy. And while I was doing all that, I was also writing for the sports section of the Duke Chronicle, the Duke student newspaper.
And I noticed the fact that you were a scientist, or math major rather, and philosophy, which as you get to higher levels, I never took more than Calculus 2 in college. But when you get to Calculus 3 and other kinds of mathematics, it becomes philosophical, does it not?
Oh yeah, I mean, past a certain point of math, you're not working with numbers anymore. You are working with logic and proving, very gross, abstract ideas. Ironically enough, that was the point in my math career where I realized, oh, I'm not going to be a classical mathematician because that wasn't the stuff that interested me as much. What interested me was how I could use math to understand the world and understand problems that were interesting based off of the things I was interested in scientifically, based off of the things that, I've always had a fascination with the brain and the mind, and that was furthered during, my undergraduate education. And so slowly over the course of my time as an undergraduate, I realized, hey, there's a way that I can mix all of these very diverse, scattered interests into sort of one field of research, one topic of study that's sort of taken me up to this point.
So they went to Michigan University?
Yep.
Ann Arbor?
Yep.
And you got a PhD there?
Correct.
And what was your PhD in?
Applied and interdisciplinary mathematics.
What does that mean?
Essentially, that was a very nice way of saying that I was not going to go sit in a room thinking about abstract, algebraic geometry and, doing Goodwill Hunting on the board. That is not at all the type of thing that I was doing. It's not what I was good at as an undergraduate. What I was interested in is how can we use the skills that I have in mathematics to apply them to other fields. And so what that program allowed me to do, and I was very lucky that things worked out, is that program really emphasized getting a full interdisciplinary education, where not only was I doing the same sort of mathematical coursework that you think of when someone has a PhD in math, but I was also taking all of the same courses that my friends who were neuroscience PhD students were taking. So I was still getting exposed to all the sort of foundational learning that I needed to do from the neuroscientific standpoint, where I then had that interdisciplinary education, where I could go to the neuroscientist and say, hey, I think this tool from computational science from mathematics might help us understand the system, or I could go to mathematicians and say, hey, here is this neuroscientific question that I think we could translate into a mathematical question that you might be able to answer. And that ability to speak across disciplines, to speak those different languages, sort of, was one of the most important skills I developed to get me where I am now.
And now you're an assistant professor at UConn.
Correct.
So my major question is, you got 2 number 1 seeds and 1 number 2 seeds. How do you decide, you don't have to answer the question, how do you decide who you're going to root for? We know who you're going to root for. We know Duke and Michigan are top, I'm sure.
As I always say, so I grew up in Michigan. I grew up in the Detroit, Ann Arbor area, diehard Michigan fan. I only don't root for Michigan when they're playing Duke. So that when Duke and Michigan played each other, I actually went to the game in DC with my dad, who is a Michigan alum, and we sort of had a fun back and forth and luckily we came out on top. I'm trying my best to add UConn fandom to a sort of a group of 3 in my college basketball obsession. It's taking a little longer than I would expect, just because there is a little bit of a rivalry inherent in there.
A little bit of
but I have always been a college sports addict, and so that very easily translated from Michigan football growing up to Duke basketball, and then back to Michigan when I was doing my grad studies. And I'm working, I have a 9-month-old daughter now, so we are becoming, UConn women's diehards. We go to as many games as we can, and my daughter's going to be growing up rooting for the Huskies, except when they play Duke.
There you go. But actually in 1998-99, when Duke had one of its best teams and UConn won, my sister's a UConn grad, so and she was in college at that point in time, all her friends called me for a couple of hours, just giving me a real razzing situation. I'd like you to explain, because I listened to one of your podcasts. You were on a podcast called Understanding Brain Dynamics Through Computational Neuroscience. I really was interested. I was pre-med for 2 years, decided not to pursue that, became a lawyer. But tell me in practical lay terms, how should the average person look at what you do and say, that might help me in my life or help our society? Tell me in lay terms what that means. What do you do as a neuroscientist?
So the easiest way that I describe this is understanding the brain is a huge, huge dartboard. And every day experimentally we are chipping away at, narrowing down that dartboard of where the answer to these really important questions are.
Is this you?
Yep, this is me at Trinity College in Hartford giving a talk to undergraduates there, sort of introducing them to computational neuroscience.
I thought that was Matt Damon perhaps doing it.
No, those are much simpler equations than any of that. But so what I like to say is that computational modeling and the tools of mathematics help us narrow down that dartboard significantly, where everything I do is an abstraction of the reality. It is not a brain. I'm not taking a brain and sticking it in my computer and poking and prodding it like you might think of, in some science fiction show where we're very, very far away from that ever being reality. But what I can do is say, using the tools that I am fluent in, using mathematics, using computer science, I can go and say, hey, I've created a model that is inspired by the brain, but a little bit simpler. And because it's just that little bit simpler, I can poke and prod it and manipulate it in ways that we don't have the capacity to do experimentally at the moment. We can't do that in a slice of brain in the dish, or we can't do that in an animal model or clinically. But by doing that and making a prediction from that simplified system, I can go back to my experimental colleagues at UConn, for instance, and say, hey, when I look at this simplified model of the brain, when I do these things in my model that you might not be able to do experimentally yet, they show that the brain might work this way. They show that this element of brain activity is potentially the most important, the most relevant for this behavior, this pathology that you're interested in. And then all of a sudden we've taken that dartboard and narrowed it down significantly. And I've said, hey, of all of the different things that might underlie this phenomena, of all the different things that might underlie this pathology, there's really good evidence that we should probably start looking here. And what I love about my job in the way I approach science is that I get something out of this whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong.
Why is that?
So if I'm right, if I make a prediction and I go to one of my experimental colleagues and they validate that prediction, heck yes, I was right. Now I have new data from the experiment. I now know something more about the system. I know more details that I can factor into my models and make a next set of predictions, make a next set of manipulations. If I'm wrong and I make a prediction that's completely not validated in the real world, then I know that something that I simplified was actually really important. Something that I had to omit from my model because we don't have that level of detail yet. Someone hasn't developed the equations that capture that phenomena. If I haven't, something that I missed was actually really important that explains that discrepancy.
And how does it help our society?
So, I mean, every health issue boils down to the brain. It really does. The brain is, if you want to get philosophical, we are our brains. Everything that we do, everything that we think is embedded in our brain, and that is something that obviously understanding the way we think and react and feel is something that's inherently part of the human experience, I think. But more practically speaking, most of the really pressing health problems that we're facing are things that we don't understand about our brain. How can the brain exist in a normal, stable, functioning state and then all of a sudden transition into a seizure, which is just such a completely antithetical, dynamical state? How can we explain that transition? We can't in most cases, otherwise we would have cured epilepsy. In fact, we have hundreds of years worth of drugs to treat epilepsy. They still only work for about 2 in 3 epilepsy patients. You could say the same thing about Alzheimer's disease. Memory loss are still very largely mysterious. We're learning more and more, but they're very largely mysterious as to how that is happening at the physical level of our brain.
I had a case involving a car collision, never an accident, it's a collision, and the patient, the client, had a lot of headaches, and she missed work for several months, and she found this great doctor in Yale, New Haven, and 6 months of treatments, whatever, the patient was really cured. And I said to the doctor in a discussion, I said, "Doctor, you saved her life. How'd you do it?" And this is a phenomenal, one of the top doctors in the country, and he said, "I don't really know." He said, "It's fine, but you know what I'm saying." He said, "I don't really know." I said, "How could you know you saved your life?" He said, "There's a whole lot of different cocktails, for example, I could have made, and we try them in each patient, and we see what works, and for this particular patient, this is what worked." So I said, "Don't be so humble, Doc," but can you talk about that?
No, I mean
Is that what you're talking about pretty much?
100%. One of the things that I've been quite lucky in my career is that I've had the chance to work directly with clinicians, with neurosurgeons specifically, to make that connection to the real world. There are people who call themselves computational neuroscientists just like I am and stay in this very abstract world where I find it most interesting when I'm doing something that is applicable, when I'm doing something that's a specific neuroscientific disorder. I worked with epilepsy a lot during my postdoc. Now I'm actually working on stroke recovery using vagus nerve stimulation.
What does that mean?
So the vagus nerve is a large nerve bundle that essentially is one of the major highways of information going into and out of your brain, controlling everything from your gut activity to your heart activity to your breathing. And because it is such a large bundle of nerves, it's very accessible to us. And it also just so happens that when you stimulate that electrically, nothing really all that bad happens. And so for decades now, because it's accessible, because there aren't significant side effects, people have stimulated that and noticed, hey, that actually helps reduce seizures in patients with epilepsy. That actually helps reduce depressive symptoms in patients with major depressive disorder. Very recently, it's been FDA approved to improve motor recovery following stroke. And it's one of these things, just like you described, where we know it works. It has hugely significant benefits. I've been lucky enough through my clinical collaborators to meet some of these patients who have had tremendous improvements in their symptoms after using this device. But we don't yet know medically what the mechanism is. We know it works. We've done all the validation studies. We've done all the tests that there aren't side effects, et cetera, et cetera. But we still don't know what's underlying that beyond I've stimulated this nerve and it's helped people recover. And if we can answer those questions, if we can understand, hey, what is the why, what's the mechanism, then we can say, oh, if I know the why, I know the mechanism, I can optimize this treatment, I can improve this treatment, I can determine whether you might be a good candidate versus you might not benefit as much. I can determine the way that I'm supposed to stimulate this nerve rather than just, doing the same old thing that we've always done. And taking that scientific problem-solving approach to clinical interventions that, like you said, are things that work, but we often don't know why. That is, I think, the next step in improving these treatments and saying, hey, we know how this works, so we know it's going to work for you, and we know how to design it to work best for you, for your situation, for your pathology.
So I guess you'd agree with me. I'm not guessing. I know this is true. You agree with me that medical research is not only necessary, it is imperative.
Medical research, I hope that is not a controversial statement to say.
It's my statement. That was my statement.
It is.
It's
yeah,
like, there was no question, Your Honor. So
let's just say it's been an interesting. I started my lab at UConn in 2024. Let's just say it's been an interesting time to be a young scientist getting up and running. But yeah, I think that understanding the brain is arguably the next great scientific frontier. And I know my colleagues in my scientific community and myself would love it if people treated that with the same fervor and intensity that we treated the space race in the 60s. That, into something that has more concrete benefits to us. We're not going to see those benefits in a year, though. This isn't the type of thing where you measure the impact on ROI, on return on investment.
Doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. And the case that people always point to now is the GLP-1s, Ozempic, these drugs that are making, are huge impacts in our society right now. No one went in and said, hey, find me a weight loss drug, find me a drug for diabetes, you have 5 years. That was founded on basic scientific research. That was as far away from neuroscience as you could possibly imagine.
It's tangential. It was an offset.
Exactly.
Like the guys who went to the moon and all the experience they did, and those experiences. Research is critical. I contribute a lot to pancreatic cancer organization. There was a lawyer I know who passed away, and I just send them money, and they say we do all monies for research, because research does matter. Do you have any particular project that you're working on in your job now, or is it just problems come up as they come up, or is there some major thing you're studying?
So my lab is part of the fun of starting a new lab is you have a lot of ideas going in about what you're going to study and what your questions are going to be, and then those all change the second you get on the ground, you meet the people you're working with, you meet the people you might collaborate with. I never thought that I was going to be studying vagus nerve stimulation. That was nowhere in my repertoire, but I just happened to meet the right people, and that research was being done at UConn Health. That gave me access to unique data, and so my lab has gone that way. The larger question that I am interested in, almost as this sort of organizing principle of my lab, is this question of the heterogeneity of the brain. The idea
What does that mean?
So essentially the fact that all the neurons in your brain, the components of your brain, are hugely, hugely variable. The metaphor I often like to use is that if you're building a house, you want every brick to be the exact same, right? You want every brick to be predictable, because that's how you make a structure that you know is safe and stable and reliable and resilient. The opposite is actually true in your brain. When you have neurons that are identical, that are overly similar, that is something that has been shown to underlie pathology. In my postdoc, we showed that is something that's potentially causal for seizures and epilepsy.
That seems counterintuitive to me.
It's 100% counterintuitive, but what happens and sort of where the power of my style of interdisciplinary research comes in is this is something that seems counterintuitive, but it's borne out in the math. It's borne out in this very fundamental structure of, hey, when you have a system full of less similar, more variable individual units, in the right circumstances, when you look at systems that are more like the brain than they are like a house, that is what gives resiliency. That is what gives stability. And arguably, that is why our brain is made up of hugely variable, distinct neurons rather than bricks that are all the same, is because that imbues extra resilience and stability. But the issue is that is the type of thing that is often hugely overlooked in my field. The first assumption that I make if I want to make a network of neurons, if I want to approximate the brain, is, well, I have to use the same set of equations for each neuron. Let's just assume that each neuron is the same. And that's something that we've done for decades because that's the first simplification that comes to mind. But the biological evidence is showing us more and more and more that that's a pretty big assumption that is diverting away from the reality.
So making assumptions, if you go into a project and you make certain assumptions, you might be hurting your research because you might be making an assumption in your research that perhaps deviates from what the reality is?
So I wouldn't say hurting,
Okay,
because
sorry.
in any scientific research, you have to have a sort of a fundamental assumption. And especially in my line of research, where again, I am not taking a brain and sticking it into a computer. I am always going to be making some idealization, some simplification in order to study a system. The question is, what do I gain and what do I lose from those assumptions? And am I drawing the right conclusions, reasonable conclusions, from the system that I've made with the assumptions that I've made? What I've found in my postdoctoral research and early in the stages of my independent lab is that this is an assumption that we've made for a long time that is actually obscuring a lot of the richness in the dynamics of the brain that we see in reality. So we need to get in and we need to build models where that isn't the assumption, where yes, there are other assumptions that we have to make. But if we loosen that assumption, if we get that closer to the biological reality, what features of the brain can we explain that we weren't able to explain with these past, more simplified models?
I see. And also when you're doing some project that you have and you say it may be unsuccessful, but you may find that the unsuccessfulness leads to some other idea that may get you to where you are. Is that a fair statement?
100%. If I build a model and I say, hey, if I add in this region of the brain or this ion channel or whatnot, and I assume that it's going to account for this behavior. Again, if that doesn't bear out, that doesn't mean that the science was not worth anything. That means, hey, my hypothesis was wrong, but I now have eliminated a couple of,
variants.
A couple of answers from the pot, right? I now know that these things that were third, fourth, fifth down my suspect list may actually be more important. Hey, that's something that can motivate my colleagues to do some, experiments in the wet lab, on the bench, in preclinical or clinical settings.
In some ways, it's parallel to what I do as a litigator, because I may get ready for a trial or get ready for a case, and I think my theory is going to be, yeah, that statute is going to, or case going to help me out. And then you read a couple more cases, say, wait a minute, this over here is different. So you have to be open-minded to what we're doing. Speaking of which, I'm going to transition to AI. Can I make, is that a bad transition?
Let's do it.
Okay, so tell me, how does AI connect, if at all, to what you do?
So too much of there's a lot of overlap between what people think of as AI research and what people think of as I do that I argue is incorrect, that I argue is actually a historical accident. When you dig into the history of AI and neural networks and what we think of as modern AI, it's built on a very, very simple mathematical model that goes back to the 1950s.
Really?
That was originally called the perceptron model.
Say it again, please.
Perceptron.
Okay.
And the perceptron model was as simple of a mathematical structure as you could think of. You can understand mathematically what's going on with this, with high school math education. And it was something that would either give you a 1 or a 0. It was binary. And
binary means?
The outputs were 1 or 0.
Okay.
Just like the basic entity of a computer code is either 1 or 0. And somewhere along the line, someone said, hey, this is sort of what the neurons in our brain do. Neurons either fire what we call an action potential. That's the signal that that tells one neuron to send a chemical signal to another, or it's not. Neurons are either a 1 or a 0. So hey, we can sort of call this model a neuron model. And so all of a sudden, these networks of perceptrons became neural networks. And there were a couple of other steps along the line where people said, hey, very, very grossly, we can sort of motivate these AI systems through some very simplified understanding of the way that the brain is connected. And all of a sudden, that became artificial intelligence because we were basing this off of, hey, the fundamental unit here is a neuron. Neurons are what our brains are made of. So therefore, this must be something that is acting the way our brain does. I would argue that if no one made that initial simplification of, let's call this the neuron model, then we wouldn't call all these things AI. We just call them better Google. And that's what, for the most part, they are, is they're just fantastic advancements on search engines, but they're not intelligence, and they're definitely not anything that bears any resemblance to our brains. And that's the biggest misconception. That's the misconception that hurts me and makes my line of work more challenging, is that there is, every month there are articles that come out in my line of work that says, hey, we created an AI system that differentiates between a dog and a cat. This must be how your brain differentiates between a dog and a cat. No, that's a way your brain might differentiate between a dog and a cat, but there's nothing in your system that is actually constrained by the actual brain. The things you're calling neurons are actually really, really far from what we know neurons are and do. The underlying architecture of your system is extremely far away from what we know the architecture of the brain is. So you found a solution, but by no means is there any evidence that it's the solution for how our actual human brains work. And that's the thing that frustrates me in this sort of ongoing discourse in the way that, let alone the way AI is influencing our lives, but influencing science, is that too often the assumption is if AI does this, this must be how the brain does it. Or if I can train an AI to do something, this must be something that our brains are capable of doing.
You know, it's as you're saying this, I'm thinking back to, I had an high school English teacher who was phenomenal. We read James Joyce, and it was a portrait of the artist as a young man, not the portrait of the artist as a young man. I think that's the connection you're making. Your discussion is fascinating to me, but I'm going to have to transition to something else. But I'm going to ask you, maybe the next show